Okay. So, welcome everyone to Module 4. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Fantastic. Okay. So, this is the first session of Module 4 where we start speaking about our rituals for resilience and how we can start applying all of these fantastic things that we've been learning over these past 3 modules and sort of synthesizing and integrating things into community practice. So I'm really excited to be here with you tonight. And so our final module together of our training program talks about some literature around yoga and trauma that informs the RFR method and the trauma responsive mind body wellness model that we are all doing together here. So we're going to be sort of integrating all of these tools that we've learned over these past weeks, and you'll be able to do some embodiment work and empowerment work, and it's going to be really exciting. And so you'll get to connect people that you work with to these social emotional learning skills that you've been developing yourselves over these past weeks. And so, yeah, it's going to then allow you to be prepared to carry these into your practices and into your work and into your communities, and to respond with the people whom you serve with empathy and compassion and attunement, and creating more healing presence and spaces for your community members. So this is really exciting. You're going to have a lot of guest teachers and guest instructors over these next few weeks, which is really exciting. So you're here with me this evening, but there's going to be some new faces that you'll get to meet over the next few sessions. So I'll just ask anyone who has some background noise going on to mute themselves, just so that you can hear me. If that's possible, or if someone else who sees the situation can also mute, that would be great. Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second and make sure everyone is on mute. Okay, and sorry about that. I just don't want to be distracted. So we're going to be looking today at healing collective trauma and looking at the legacy of intergenerational trauma and social justice and empowered leadership. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. So the first thing that I wanted to sort of cover with you, and I know this is a bit of a review, I understand that you've already talked about and touched on intergenerational trauma previously, so some of this will be just a bit of a review of some of the information that you may have already heard. So hopefully you'll find it helpful to kind of go through it again. But as we know, intergenerational trauma, or it is sometimes referred to as transgenerational or multi-generational trauma, it is defined as trauma that gets passed down from those who directly experience an incident or a situation or an event to subsequent generations. And so oftentimes when we speak about intergenerational trauma, we talk about it in terms of the context of historical trauma. And so historical trauma is a traumatic experience or an event that a group collectively experienced together within society or an entire community, ethnic group or national group. And then, of course, the impact of that historical trauma sort of translates to become intergenerational trauma for their children and grandchildren, as those things get exposed and passed on from the parents to their children, and then from those children to the next generation. And so intergenerational trauma is not confined to only historical traumatic events. intergenerational trauma can exist and be passed through generations, regardless of whether it has been experienced on a larger scale or whether it was just focused on one individual or family member. And so it may begin with a traumatic event that affects an individual or multiple family members or a larger community group, or it can be a whole cultural group or ethnic group. And so it really, the size of the trauma doesn't really matter. What makes it intergenerational trauma is the symptoms that and maladaptive coping strategies that come out of that then get passed along to children and grandchildren. And so historical trauma meets 3 criteria typically. So we have widespread effects, we have collective suffering, and we have malicious intent. So the malicious intent piece is really interesting. So who would, like, what is the first kind of example of historical trauma that may come to your mind when you think about those 3 things? Widespread effects, collective suffering, and malicious intent. What is one of the most common examples we might think of? Feel free to unmute and just shout it out.
Indigenous.
Holocaust is one of them.
Holocaust for sure, yeah. Someone mentioned Indigenous, absolutely. So those are really great examples. So the Indian residential schools, as they are called in Canada, but certainly I know that these schools existed also in the United States for First Nations people. And so, yeah, the Holocaust, of course, being probably the most well publicized example in recent history of a historical trauma, for sure. But we also have more recent examples like the genocide that happened in Rwanda, of course, and we had Canadian peacekeepers involved there. The situation in Ukraine back under Stalin's rule, where it's called the Holodomor, which was the starvation of Ukrainian people, which was purposeful. And then we have, of course, the purges that happened within Russia under Stalin's rule as well. And so these are all sort of fairly recent examples of historical trauma and what those things look like. And so I did want to kind of just stop here and show you a couple of little videos. They're very short, both talking about the impact of the experience of Indian residential schools on the survivors and their families. So I'm just going to switch over to a different screen to share this with you. And I'm going to optimize this for video, so you'll see me disappear. Excuse me, really briefly. So So the first one is just a brief overview of the Indian residential schools and how that translated to an example of intergenerational trauma. And the second video, we look at an actual survivor who shares a little bit of their story. So can everyone see this video?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I just need someone to confirm because I can't see anyone now. And please let me know if you cannot hear.
The goal was to resolve the so-called Indian problem. So in 1883, the Canadian government officially instituted the residential school system. By the 1930s, nearly 75% of Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15 were forced to attend these schools. Unable to return home for months or even years, Indigenous children were often neglected and abused, stripped of their language and culture. Thousands of children died while at residential school. Others went missing, never to be seen again. At least 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were institutionalized over the course of more than 100 years. There are approximately 80,000 living survivors. Some have become leaders in their communities, teachers, counselors, commissioners. For many, the trauma of the mental, physical, and sexual abuse they suffered hasn't faded. The children and grandchildren of survivors have inherited those wounds. They have persisted, manifesting as depression, anxiety, family violence, suicidal thoughts, substance use. This is called intergenerational trauma, and it can take generations to heal. For Indigenous peoples, that healing can involve a return to the culture that was taken from them. For others, it involves formal acknowledgement of their experiences.
There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again.
For Canada, it means confronting the past and working towards reconciliation. Laws and apologies are necessary to help us move forward, but reconciliation also requires true understanding and empathy to create space where healing is possible.
So that's just a little brief overview of the history of the Indian residential schools. And next I'm going to share a small clip where a survivor of one of the schools shares about their experience and the impact that this has on their family. Can everyone see this video?
Yes.
Thank you.
There's black bars on the video, like across the picture. I don't know why.
Is everyone experiencing that?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I don't understand why either. Okay, let me just refresh this and I'll stop share and reshare. Is this showing up clearly now?
No.
Huh.
They're kind of at the bottom. There's one big one right at the bottom. So as long as you don't make the video large, it won't
Okay.
interfere with the video.
Okay, I don't understand why that's happening, as it seems perfectly fine at my end. So as long as everyone can see okay, can hear, let me know if it changes.
I guess it's just that family connection and
Okay.
just not having some kind of memory at times. And it always goes back to being robotic. No feeling, no emotions, no nothing. If you got hurt, no one was there to comfort you. You know, things like just things that as a child I should have gotten from a loving parent, you know, or an adult who looked after me. I wasn't able to parent my children as well as I wish I could have. No one ever read to me. You know, no one ever came and cuddled me or, you know, gave me a hug if I was feeling sad or upset or I'd fallen down and no one was there for me. I had to just basically pick myself up and keep going. I'd like to think I'm getting better at it with my grandchildren.
Did your parents go to residential schools?
Yes, they did. She just told me that she had actually gotten punched in the face for speaking her language, and she flew across the room, she said, and landed against a rad, and her tooth protruded through her upper lip, so she had a scar on her lip. She also told us that she did not teach us her language, which was Ojibwe, because she didn't want us to experience what she went through. It was her way of protecting us. My dad, he just kind of said, you know what, he says, with you, he says, we were like little robots. We were like little soldiers, he says. We used to parade around like soldiers, he said. And we were so hungry. And that's where he learned how to eat raw potatoes. I used to wonder why he used to eat raw potatoes, but they were hungry. So they would eat raw potatoes, and then they'd take some of the potatoes and at night and they'd exchange for bread with other students. If I was to give advice, I would suggest that people start to listen, to allow us to talk and to be heard and to listen. That's such an integral piece of this whole process, is listening and actually believing us. You know, because at the beginning, people said that we all colluded across Canada to make this story up. And I was like, how could we possibly have ever done that? We couldn't. So it's that belief that things really did happen to us. And it's affected us in many ways personally, you know, in our everyday life, our relationships with people and our family. And it's because of that relationship being affected, we can't be who we should be as healthy individuals, as parents, you know, community members, cousins, relatives, any kind of relations that we have. I think that's very important, and that we all sit together. It's nice when we can sit together too and talk, you know, like how can we move forward? Let's move together. Let's move forward together.
So there is a series of interviews that were conducted by the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, interviewing survivors about their experience who wanted to share. And so they did this series of interviews with various survivors across the country and their experience. And so I just thought that this woman's message about how it impacted her ability to parent her own children and how she wishes she had been able to parent them better. And, you know, she's hoping that she's doing a better job second time around with her grandchildren, but that she really didn't have an opportunity to be the loving parent that she wanted to be because she was never given that love and support from her own mother, who, as we heard, was a student and victim of the residential schools where she was severely beaten and abused. So the legacy of trauma, the legacy of the impact of these horrendous historical events are still very present with us today, even though we might ourselves be removed from them because it happened years and years ago. I mean, but really, in terms of the residential schools, I'm not sure about the statistics of it in the United States, but in Canada, the last residential school did not close until 1996. That is not that long ago, 1996. And so these are things that are very, very real and very relevant and very recent. And things that we I'm so glad to see that it's actually finally coming to light. I used to be a history teacher. And so I used to teach, I'm from Nova Scotia, so I used to teach a course called Mi'kmaq Studies. And so that is the name of the tribe on the east coast of Canada. So I felt very uncomfortable as a non-Mi'kmaq person being asked to teach this course. And so I asked to go on a specific training where I got to spend a week on a reserve and get training from First Nations healers and leaders and teachers. And so it was a really fantastic experience. But I used to share with the students about these examples of things in the residential schools and whatever. And, you know, it wasn't talked about at that point. And that also wasn't that long ago. You know, 10 years ago, I taught this course, and this was not something that was well known. It's not that the information didn't exist, but you really had to go digging for it. And I did go digging for it to show documentaries and examples of these things that were happening, and how, you know, our government, the Canadian government in 1912, used the exact statement. So the creation of the residential schools were what they considered to be the final solution to the Indian question. Where have we heard those words? So it's very chilling because, you know, we all have these dark pieces of history attached to us, whether we're Canadian or American or British or whatever. We have these dark pieces of history, and the legacy of those historical events continues to kind of be with us and haunt people who were subjected to that trauma in the past. And so, yeah, I just wanted to showcase a little bit of that with you here today, because quite often we might be serving people and working with people in our communities and in our day-to-day life with work who could be survivors of some form of intergenerational trauma. And so, as you may have already talked about in previous sessions around intergenerational trauma, you know, the symptoms of people who might be suffering from it look a little bit similar to symptoms of PTSD, which of course we've talked about before, but there's also sort of a bit of a different slant to it, because we really see it show up in terms of parenting styles. We see it show up in terms of difficulty letting things go. So hoarding type of behaviors, or hiding food, overeating, these types of things, secretiveness, really a large amount of distrust for authority, distrust for institutions. I mean, not that that's not valid, because they aren't always as truthful as they should be, but a real sort of high level sort of paranoia in terms of distrust and secretiveness that exists. Hypervigilance, of course, high anxiety, panic attacks. And so we really see how, if you are a child and your parent, your primary caregiver, is suffering in these ways, it is impossible for you as the child to not be impacted by that in some way. And so intergenerational trauma was first studied actually in 1966 by a Canadian psychiatrist. And she noted these really high rates of psychological distress among descendants of Holocaust survivors. So Holocaust survivors, of course, as we know, went through horrific torture and physical abuse and extensive trauma, and lived in fear of their lives every single day. I used to actually be friends with a survivor who was in Auschwitz in Nova Scotia. He was given the Order of Nova Scotia and the Order of Canada, as he used to go around and tell his story in different schools. He unfortunately died 7 years ago, but he lived into his 90s, and he spoke almost to the very end and shared his story. He also wrote a book. And so when you hear these people speak about their experience, and you can see the pain, you know, decades later, you can see the pain in their face, you can hear the pain in their voice. And it's very chilling, because it doesn't matter how much time passes, those memories cannot be erased, of course. And so it's impossible, for survivors of something like the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide to not have impacted their ability to parent their children, or manage their emotions in maladaptive ways. So these symptoms, they were also found that these symptoms, these exact symptoms that we're seeing here from the survivors directly, were also found in the children of those survivors. And so that was really interesting. And so there has been a wide pool of research since then, and there's this consistent prevalence of trauma disorders that exist among the children of trauma survivors. And so work on intergenerational trauma began specifically with studies on the Holocaust and those generations. The field has expanded quite vastly to include groups of people who have been party to various types of extreme suffering through different forms of oppression or torture or stigmatization, marginalization, in ways that can create this really lasting damage. And so, you know, a prime example, of course, being the Indian residential schools. And so there are, generally speaking, three components to intergenerational trauma. And so we have, of course, to consider the specific nature of what the trauma was that the parent went through, the transmission of that trauma from one generation to the next, so to the children and then subsequently to the grandchildren. And then, of course, the behavioral characteristics that manifested in those subsequent generations. So in the research that has been conducted since the 60s, excuse me, they found that transmission occurs, of course, through day-to-day experiences. So of course, through sociocultural, communication styles, and also something called epigenetics, which is really interesting. So initially, they thought that children and grandchildren kind of inherited those traumatic symptoms and maladaptive behaviors from learned experience. So it was thought initially, well, because you're living in the home with the survivor of the traumatic event, you're learning those behaviors. And so, yes, absolutely, that was in play. But they also have there's this other budding sort of group of research that's happening right now, where they're actually looking at something called epigenetics, where they're discovering that DNA can actually be modified as a result of exposure to traumatic event. And so your DNA actually gets passed through the genome from the parent to the children. So like DNA gets transmitted from the parent to the child with those sort of traumatic, what's the word I'm looking for? Mutations. And so this is a really fascinating component to this research. And so there's still, more to be done. And so they're still looking into this, but this is what they're finding, is that there is this quite likely connection of the DNA actually being altered as a result of being exposed to these highly traumatic events. And so it's not just learned behaviors, it's also this traumatic DNA transmission that's happening. And so parenting and modeling, of course, are going to play significant roles in anyone's development of emotional response and behaviors and that kind of thing. And so, for example, we know that in healthy environments, children learn their coping skills from their family members, and their resilience and ability to navigate in the world stems from, hopefully, an emotionally stable and supportive environment for the most part. And we see children often in school settings, of course, who come with these horrific labels of oppositional defiance and all of these things, but really it's trauma. And this is how it's showing up with anger issues and inability to follow direction and this dismissal of authority, like these types of things. And it's because they are vicariously. Oh yes, exactly. It Didn't Start With You is a great read. Absolutely. I actually have that in in your manual. It's one of the recommended resources for further reading that I have in there. Yeah, It Didn't Start With You is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing that. And so, yeah, when parents live under these oppressive circumstances, whatever they may be, they can develop these survival messages. And so this is an example of how maladaptive coping or inaccurate thought patterns are problematic, because the survival message for that parent was, don't ask for help, it's dangerous. Don't draw attention to yourself, something bad will happen. And so that is the message then, if that's what they believe, like their core belief is that it is dangerous to ask for help. When they have children, they're going to want to do everything they can to protect their children. And so they will teach their children, don't ask for help, it's dangerous. People can't be trusted, they will hurt you. And so this is going to be passed from one generation to the next. And so while these messages may have helped protect the parents in a specific situation, that isn't a blanket universally true statement. And so, but that is what they believe to be universally true. And so that is what they inherit, then pass along to their children. And so this would then causes those later generations to have this fearful and distrustful outlook on life. And so we saw a little bit, with this woman, the Indigenous woman who was speaking around, she didn't have anyone reading to her. She didn't have anyone loving her. She didn't have the support that she should have had as a child. She didn't have any of that. She didn't grow up with that. She didn't know how to give that because she never received it herself. And so these are the examples of things that we see. And so studies have shown that these specific maladaptive behavior patterns within trauma survivors' children and grandchildren, like unhealthy codependency and enmeshment, an obsession with the trauma event, control issues, avoidant attachment styles. We'll talk more about attachment on Saturday. I'm really excited about that. And an overprotective attitude towards their parents. And these are all what we call reparative adaptational impacts. And so what that means is that the children are trying to repair or fix the wounds of their parents' traumatic past and create this world of safety for their parent. And so the child takes on this massive responsibility that it should never be theirs to try and, heal the traumatic injuries of their parents. And so then we see these behaviors manifesting in the children. So, further talking about how trauma gets transmitted. So I mentioned that, initially they thought these behaviors were passed through learned behaviors, but this epigenetics is so incredibly fascinating. So yeah, I already mentioned this, so this is just sort of a further information about that, but I already mentioned that to you. But yeah, the DNA can have permanent alterations to our genomes, like from trauma and stress. Like this is groundbreaking and fascinating discovery. And so I'm so curious to see where that leads us in terms of our ability to offer different trauma responsive care as we learn more about that. So how do we deal with the legacy of trauma? How do we start healing? How can we start breaking the cycle? And so I thought it would be really appropriate to sort of highlight how this is now being showcased in children's movies. And so these 3 movies here, they're all Pixar, so they're all from Disney, coincidentally. But in the last couple of years, this concept of intergenerational trauma has been showcased in really diverse and beautiful ways. In the movie Coco, which is based in Mexico around the celebration of the Day of the Dead. And in this past year, Encanto, which was following a Colombian family, and then also most recently Turning Red, which follows a young Asian girl as she comes of age, and it's actually set on the backdrop of Toronto, which is pretty exciting for us Canadians. And so I love that they are finally starting to really, and of course it's a children's movie, and so things kind of get wrapped up a little bit more nicely than it might actually be in real life. But I really love that these messages and these stories are starting to be told in this, popular media way, because it gives us a reference point and an example to share in starting to have these conversations with our children and grandchildren. If we want to be the cycle breakers, or if we, know people, or we have people in our lives who are trying to be cycle breakers from their experience of intergenerational trauma, these are really excellent tools to be able to open those conversations in less threatening and sort of scary ways, because we can depersonalize it a little bit by referring to the characters in any of these films. And so in Turning Red, which is the top left here, we have the main character is this young girl in the middle. Her name is May. And so she turns red when she comes of age, and she turns into this giant red poofy animal. And no one ever tells her about it. She doesn't know that it's coming. And so when it happens to her, it's terrifying and she doesn't know what to do. And of course, she's got given no tools about how to handle the situation. And so later through the movie, we learn that, it's something that they have to learn how to tame, and that it's, it's referred to as a bad thing and it has to be gotten rid of. And there's a ceremony to like expunge the red from her. And so we learn about, over the time of the movie, this intergenerational trauma that gets passed down from the grandmother who is here onto May's mother, who then, is distant and cold and doesn't connect with her daughter in a real way and doesn't provide open dialogue. And so May is caught between this world of trying to please her mother and hold the line of her Asian culture and do what makes sense to her, and be a part of her Canadian friend group and all of this. And so there's this real delicate balance that she's trying to manage. And then in Coco, in Mexico, we have Miguel, who is wanting to become a musician, and music has been banned because of this terrible thing that happened. And his grandmother, Abuelita, is adamant that music can never exist and that no one can hear it, listen to it, or even think about playing it, because of the terrible things that happened. And music is bad, and music causes bad things to happen. And so this is the trauma injury that exists within the family and the community. And so she has this hold over the whole community. And then, of course, in Encanto, we follow a family who are descendants of the Colombian Civil War. And so it's backdrop in Colombia. And we see the grandmother, the matriarch of the family, Abuela, who is desperately trying to preserve the miracle that protected her and her daughters when she was fleeing from the Civil War and the violence, but her husband didn't make it. And her husband died while they were fleeing. And so in each of these films, we see different manifestations of how the original trauma in these cases affected the matriarchs of the families. And so in these cases, they're all the different grandmothers, which then in turn impacted their children, the parents, and then of course the younger generations, the grandchildren. And so we have the first one, which we call victim mentality. And so in a victim mentality of a trauma survivor, of course, depression is a really frequent occurrence. And so this causes a parent that has experienced the trauma to self-isolate, or to possibly become really combative and argumentative. And so we see this represented in Abuelita in Coco, and she is so adamant and really like fiery and angry and sort of scary, as when she feels like the safety of her family is going to be threatened because music, Miguel wants to bring music back into their world. We have the fighter mentality, which is sort of opposite of victim, where fighters actually kind of arm themselves with this hard outer shell, this stoic exterior, and they're extremely intolerant of weakness, intolerant of self-pity, and you just do what you have to do to stiff upper lip and get on with it. And so we see that recognized in Abuela, in the Encanto movie, where she really reinforces the gifts of all of the special magical gifts that each of her children and grandchildren have been given, and she reinforces this narrative that we have to be of service, and we have to help others, and we have to continue to be strong for the community, and we have to do all these things, and we have to use our gifts to serve, to work. And so if you haven't seen the movie, there's a really wonderful song by the eldest, I think it's the eldest sister. She's the strongest one. She's a strong woman. But the pressure of all the weight that she's carrying, both figuratively and literally, is starting to, cause her to crack and to burn out. And then there's those who made it manifestation, which is defined by socioeconomic success and distancing themselves from their experience of the trauma and the experience of other trauma survivors. And we see this very much depicted in Turning Red and her mother's sort of distance from her own mother, her distance from her family, her siblings, and the, not talking about anything that happened before and focusing on their family's business and focusing on moving forward. And so these films, I just love them. And if you haven't seen them, I highly recommend them. They're not just for kids, they're for everyone. And they're just so helpful to be able to start the conversations around breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma in more sort of approachable and easy ways. So we're actually going to look at a little video clip here. Excuse me. And we have the narrator is going to walk us through example of Encanto and how the generational trauma was represented and kind of his how it spoke to him regarding his own personal experience.
I cannot watch Encanto without absolutely breaking down. When I went to see Encanto in theaters, I did it because it was basically the only movie out at the moment that seemed entertaining. I did not know what I was getting into. The movie starts with a Pixar short about a raccoon parent trying to protect their curious cub while they search for food on the beach. The parent has a scar and absolutely no patience for their child's antics. It becomes obvious why later when the cub's curiosity lands them in trouble, as they come face to face with a coyote. They escape, but not before receiving a scar like the one that adorns their parents' face. The short has a second half, where the cub, grown up now, has a child of their own, one who is just as curious as they were. In trying to protect their own kid, the raccoon sees their abusive parent in themselves. The raccoon then takes a different tact. Instead of simply scolding the cub, the raccoon explains why they have to be so protective by showing them the dangers of the coyote and how it scarred them growing up. It's this change in approach that breaks the cycle of raccoons needing to be forever scarred in order to survive. The cub can learn the lessons that were hard taught to the parent without needing to be hurt themselves. The short is incredibly appropriate to beginning the conversation on generational trauma that the following feature film spends its runtime exploring. And beyond that, it tells the audience that if this short made you cry, you're about to be going through it with absolutely no mercy.
Many years ago, this candle blessed our family with a miracle. Our house, our casita, came to life with magic.
Generational trauma is exactly what it sounds like. It's trauma that isn't experienced by just one person, but extends from one generation to the next. When someone says break the cycle, they're referring to the cycle of trauma and abuse that they were born into, potentially ensuring that the generation that comes after them isn't forced to feel the pain that persisted in the family up to that point. For example, in a 1988 study published in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry, they found that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were overrepresented by about 300% in psychiatric care referrals. While extraordinary and horrible events like these are very likely to cause generational trauma, it can be caused by systemic issues like racism, poverty, and abuse. Also, just because you don't have some horrible event like the Colombian Civil War or the Holocaust in your direct past, that doesn't mean you aren't a product of generational trauma. Sometimes it's subtle and normalized behaviors enforced by tradition or religion. These can all lead to issues like hypervigilance, distrust, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, and issues with self-esteem and self-confidence, all things explored by the film Encanto. Let's look at Luisa.
Your eyes doing the thing.
I'm the strong one. I'm not nervous. I'm as tough as the crust of the earth is.
Okay.
In her song Surface Pressure, she expresses the burdens she willingly and without complaint takes on for the whole family, even though the endless expectations are slowly wearing her down. Luisa's character is threatened by the idea that her strength alone won't be enough to keep the family together, which is what she'd been doing under the surface up to that point. This makes me think of my own life as the middle child. And if you're a middle child, you know that you're always trying to keep your family together. And I always felt like expired peanut butter trying to hold together two halves of a sandwich that just did not want to be together. We had a lot of fighting growing up, and sometimes it seemed like I was the only one who just wanted everyone to get along. And if you do that long enough, the cracks begin to form and eventually break. Mirabel and her sisters Luisa and Isabella all had this familial pressure exerted upon them, but it's personalized and expressed in ways that will hurt them uniquely. The ways I see some generational trauma being expressed today are through setting expectations for the next generation that they can't possibly fulfill, and using the suffering that they were forced to go through as the justification for that pressure. That may present itself as a parent pressuring their child to go to school to become a doctor or a lawyer, regardless of what that child actually wants to do with their life. My parents were very open to whatever we wanted to end up doing, but notably, I'm the only one of their 4 kids who isn't a lawyer or a doctor or on the way to become one of those. That could be the result of an underlying pressure to succeed in traditional ways, or maybe they're just better at it than me. It makes me think of Mirabel as the only one in the family not given a gift. Mirabel's character arc is about trying to save her family from falling apart, only to find out that she is the cause of the destruction of their familial home and the end of their magical gifts. Her efforts to prevent this fate end up only bringing it about faster. The film takes a turn here, however. Mirabel identifies that the reason that their powers are fading, the reason that the casita is falling apart, is because the matriarch of the family, Abuela, is putting all of these unreasonable expectations on her children and grandchildren. This realization finally breaks the miracle that gave everyone their gifts and destroys the casita. Mirabel runs off, likely feeling a wave of guilt that this is all her fault. Nevertheless, the Abuela comes to speak with Mirabel and affirms that her granddaughter was right. It was her own fear that destroyed everything. But what the film does incredibly well with all of its characters, that it humanizes them and forces you to empathize with them, it continues here. We see Abuela's past, losing her home and husband in the Colombian Civil War. It's the fear of it happening again that causes her to set such a high standard for all of her family. She worries that if the miracle ever fails, then the horrors of war may visit them again. I think we sometimes forget how close we are to periods of extreme violence. World War II was only 80 years ago. My own grandfather grew up in a home in the Netherlands where his family harbored Jews in their attic. He ended up fleeing to Canada, eventually traveling to the United States. That's the man that raised my mother, who raised me. My dad's parents lived in the mountains of West Virginia in the midst of a ravaged economy in the wake of the collapse of the coal mines, the rise in drug abuse, and the rampant widespread poverty in that area. My dad's parents took him out of there and brought him to Michigan, where he met my mom, and both of them got an education and jobs in the healthcare field. That's the world I was brought into. I didn't see World War II, and I didn't grow up in a world of drug abuse and poverty, but I was raised by the people who were raised by the people who did. And those people gave me the chance to end a cycle of generational trauma within my own family. The thing that Encanto nails is that it doesn't excuse or forgive Abuela's actions just because of the trauma. It allows Mirabel the chance to offer her forgiveness because Abuela recognizes and acknowledges what she did was wrong. It's this willingness to grow that allows the family to work together and recreate the casita, reignite the miracle, and rebuild their family. I think that's the most important thing about the movie. Your parents and grandparents may not be like the ones in Encanto, where they're willing to see the mistakes they made and grow from them. For folks in the LGBT community, those who leave their religion, and those that put a stop to harmful sexist, racist, or classist traditions, your family may not be willing to grow with you. At that point, ending the cycle may mean cutting them out of your life. It's the reason found family is so important. The reason my own parents are still such a huge presence in my life is that they have grown and changed as we have grown and changed. They were willing to hear where they went wrong, and we were able to accept that while our parents aren't perfect people, they are people who are willing to change because they love their kids. The way the movie Encanto approaches generational trauma seems to be hitting others in the same way it's hitting me. I seriously wondered if my brain chemicals were whacked because I couldn't hold myself together while watching this film. But I've seen many people on TikTok recently expressing the same thing. Seeing yourself in the members of the Madrigal family is something that's both triggering to the part of you that has experienced generational trauma, but is also healing. I've gotten a lot of comfort from knowing that I'm not alone in this experience, and I feel hope that there are many of us who have the scars of generational trauma, but are ready to break the cycle. People are recognizing the sources of their trauma and are getting help. Therapy, medication, ending harmful traditions. The work is being done to make sure the next generation doesn't need to feel the scars to learn the lessons of the past. Encanto is a magical film because it's a story that speaks to many in different ways. I really think this movie has created a space to process feelings of hurt and begin healing. You've heard how it spoke to me, but I think there are a lot of elements in this movie that speak to others in unique ways. If you want to leave a comment about your experience with this film, or generational trauma, or just want to say hi, I'd love to read it. Thanks so much for watching. I've discovered that people in the tabletop role-playing space
So I hope that you found that to be,
seem to love Encanto.
I hope that you found that to be helpful.
And
There we go. Sorry about that. I just thought it was a really nice description and showing examples of how the trauma gets passed from generations to generations and how that manifests and show up in different ways and feels like pressure and feels like many different things. And of course, the elephant in the room that no one's talking about, which was the grandmother's fear of what may happen. And so in terms of healing these things, what are ways in which intergenerational trauma can be healed? How do we move forward, from this legacy of trauma? And so I know in the last session that I spent with you, where we talked about the window of tolerance and traumatic stress, we spent a great deal of time talking about grief work and the different examples of grief processing interventions that we can use. And so in this case, of course, the grief work would be extremely important collectively within the family system, and also on an individual level in terms of the personal experience that each person is carrying. We talked a lot, of course, about internal family systems for IFS work as well in our previous session together. This is a place where IFS work is extremely helpful and very often used in family therapy dynamics in terms of healing these generational traumatic injuries. And so internal family systems plays a very, very powerful role here in an opportunity for healing. Similarly, we talked also about narrative and storytelling and the importance of being able to feel empowered by using our voice and naming what happened and talking about what happened and retelling the story from a place of empowerment and survivorship. The naming what happened becomes really important, because I think what happens, and you may know this in your own experience, when we don't talk about something or we don't say it out loud, that thing becomes really, really big. It becomes huge, like the big black dog that was, represented in the externalizing depression film that we saw. That dog got really, really, really big to the point where it was, sitting on top of him and suffocating him, because he wasn't talking about it. He was just trying to avoid it and hide from it. And so when we don't name it, when we don't talk about it, it really gives it so much more power. And so in child therapy, as I used to work in child and family therapy, we call this name it to tame it, right? And so if we're able to name what happened, then it takes away some of that power. And each time we talk about it and name it and say it out loud, it's power over us. And the fear that we carried around that thing, it isn't quite as punching. And so similarly, this retelling the story and telling it from a different point of view, a different framework, and sort of also telling it from a place of moving forward is a really powerful way of doing this sort of generational healing work. Also, of course, as the example just talked about, if the survivor of the original trauma can acknowledge the impact that their maladaptive behaviors and coping strategies has had on the family system and on other people, that goes a very long way in healing the relationships between the family members. And also, of course, being able to recognize and validate the emotions of each individual family member's experience. So if we look at the sisters in Mirabelle's family, there's her, and then there's the strong sister Louisa, and then there's her other sister who is referred to as the golden child, who is perfect, and she's forced to think about marrying someone and having kids with this person, because that is, she is responsible for carrying the family line, moving forward. And so there's all of these feelings that each of her sisters have that Mirabelle is not aware of, because they haven't talked about it. And so being able to recognize, validate, and talk about these things really helps to provide understanding and context for how each person is coming to the situation. And then, of course, we work on building resilience. I know resilience is a really big, an important sort of buzzword as well, and something that is talked about a lot in trauma recovery work. And so when we look at resilience, we talk about an individual's ability to positively cope with stress and adversity. And so the ability for us to bounce back to, a previous state or a functional state of normalcy, using the experience of adversity that we went through to enhance our ability to be flexible, so that increasing our window of tolerance, and which also helps us with our overall daily functioning. And so resilience is more than one thing, and it doesn't show up in only one way. And so it has this very multidimensional aspect. And so we've got cognitive resilience, which is where we look at how we interpret events. So I talked about the example of the train stopping on the tracks in a previous session. And so how we interpret events, how we appraise something, the traits that, or information, the blanks that we fill in and attribute to the situation, and then how those daily stressors in our life circumstances are negotiated. So how do we cope with those things? We look at behavioral resilience, which are our habits of persistence and endurance, how we're able to do that, how well we're able to do that in face of obstacles and failures. And so we look at behavioral practice and positive reinforcement here. Motivational resilience is having this clear sense of a life purpose and a commitment, this will to live, to do something, to whatever it is that you feel driven to do while we have this time on the earth. Existential and spiritual resilience, where we look at the sense of a larger purpose and the meaning of human life. And relational resilience, where we look at this sense of social connectedness, community, engagement, and altruism, and wanting to give back and wanting to help others within our community. Emotional resilience shows up in our ability to tolerate negative emotions, so that distress tolerance piece, emotion regulation, and maintaining emotional confidence and hopefulness. And so we look at that, that's where we talked about emotional intelligence and emotion regulation skills, and being in control of our emotions rather than letting them overtake us. And so a big question and topic for conversation, of course, is how do we build resilience? And so there's different ways. We have social engagement, of course, so we encourage always, increasing social connections that are positive, avoiding social isolation if we can, although that was very difficult during the pandemic, I realized, and so we had to get creative and do virtual connectedness. And so these are social connection and social engagement is one of the best ways to cultivate resilience. Positive peer relationships and supportive interaction with other people, maybe people who have gone through something similar, are known to be really important factors. And we have self-awareness and self-care. And so we all know what those things are. And so, we practice self-awareness, and we, make a conscious effort to clearly understand our own strengths and areas for development, and emotions and values and our tendencies, being aware of our biases. And our self-care is, how do we treat ourselves? How do we make sure that we are giving our mind, bodies, and souls exactly what they need to thrive? Attention and focus is another way in which we can cultivate resilience, where we, practice attention and our ability to tune out information, sensations, distractions that are not relevant at the moment, and instead being able to channel and fully focus our energy on the information that is important. We also call, in mindfulness practice, we also call this one mindfulness. And so the benefit of undivided focus is the increased likelihood of achieving this state of flow. Looking for meaning and finding meaning is another way to cultivate resilience. And so finding meaning is sort of the act of making sense of things, and exploring the significance of things, or how we experience a certain situation. And so the research actually has shown us that cultivating a sense of meaning in our lives can contribute to more positive mental health overall. And a growth mindset. So this is a really important concept because many survivors of traumatic experience develop quite naturally as a result of their trauma, scarcity mindset. And so that's why we see those behaviors like hoarding and secretiveness and overeating and these types of things, because the scarcity, this feeling of never knowing when we're going to be able to meet our needs or get get food or get water or get clothing or whatever, we might need that someday. And so we might be in a situation where everything's taken from us, and if we don't hang on to it all right now, we're this is terrible, we can't get rid of anything. And so we have to replace that with what we call growth mindset, where we really focus on the concept that if we're not so fixed on worrying about what may or may not happen, and that there's flow in the universe and energy and things will come to us as we need, this is a really important part of building resilience. And it's the opposite of that fixed or scarcity mindset, when we believe that we're limited. And so our growth mindset acknowledges that we can learn from challenges and we can grow through experience and increase our abilities and things that are available to us. So if we think about the legacy of trauma, we think about, I'm sure we might have all heard of, we all carry an emotional backpack. And so our emotional backpack is this invisible weight that we carry on our shoulders and on our backs that we start to fill up in childhood, and we carry and we keep adding to that backpack as we move through our lives. And it gets heavier and heavier and heavier with each trauma or difficulty or challenging time that we face. And by the time we reach adulthood, we can imagine that this backpack is now really weighing us down, and maybe it weighs 100 pounds. So I'd like for us to kind of engage in a little bit of a discussion of some things that might be in our own personal backpacks. So this could, feel free to unmute or drop in the chat. There might be some examples of things that we might find in our own emotional backpacks. Yes, being the black sheep in the family. Love that. I'm actually going to start a little whiteboard here and see if I can share this with you all. So I'm just going to make notes here. So being the black sheep.
The I don't deserve concept, mindset.
Oh, yes. And not being worthy. Yeah. Okay, hopefully I can figure this out here when we're being the black sheep. This is my first time using Blackboard officially. Not worthy mindset. Yeah. What else? What other examples might be in our emotional backpacks? Yes, taking responsibility for other people's problems.
Not having a voice.
Mm-hmm.
What you say doesn't matter.
These are great examples. Thank you so much for sharing. What else?
You have to be productive. You cannot just be, you have to achieve something.
Achievement is how we measure our words. Yeah. Great example. A big one that comes up often in my work is not enough, not being something enough. Yes. Regrets. Feelings of guilt. Shame. What else? I hope everyone can think of one thing to contribute. This is a great discussion. If you think about the Encanto example, what do you think was in the strong sister Luisa's emotional backpack?
She was gonna save everybody. She's the savior mentality.
Mhm. Stiff upper lip, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, that's strong all the time. It's stoic. Mhm.
Not be able to show your emotions.
Mhm.
The labeling that comes with gender, like, girls belong in the kitchen, boys don't cry. that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Gender labeling, great example. Okay, this is some really great examples. Thank you so much, everybody. Yeah, only speak when spoken to. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yep. 100%. Write that down. Only speak. I don't know if anyone ever heard, children should be seen and not heard. That was always a big one in the past as well. So this is, we're gonna get into some breakout rooms now. So thank you so much for sharing. We're gonna close the whiteboard now. So how many we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Can each of you please tell me where you're from in the chat?
I'll start first, is that okay? It's Elena, in the chat, I thought it was
Yeah,
straight
just
up.
where you're from. Yeah, where you are right now or where you're from. Yeah. So, the reason I'm asking is I'm trying to figure how we can divide up by our regions. Lots of Canadians. Is everybody in here from somewhere in Canada? Vancouver, Vancouver, Vancouver. Toronto. Okay, so we're gonna have a Vancouver group. We're gonna have an Ontario group. Actually, no, we're not gonna have an Ontario group. We're gonna have a Nova Scotia, Montreal, and Ontario group. And we're gonna have an Alberta group. Oh, and we've got somebody else coming in here. Melody. Oh, I love the little the puppy in the Santa hat. So cute. So we're going to go into our breakout. We're going to break out into groups in a minute. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about our community backpacks. And so as best as possible, I'm going to try and regionally group us together. I know it's hard because Canada is a very vast, large country. So it might be tricky. We'll do the best that we can. So within your smaller groups, I would love for you to brainstorm all of the trauma and adversities or stressors that are impacting the communities that you're in. What do you think might be in those community backpacks? And I would ask someone in your group to be the sort of note taker or the admin assistant there to just jot down and do that brainstorm just like we did together. And so what are the community stressors and adversities and traumas that you can identify within your communities? And then identify what are the protective and promotive factors that might exist in the community. So remember way back at the beginning of our first module, we talked about so the biopsychosocial theory, and we talked about the 4 Ps, and protective factors being positive things that are in place, positive things that exist to help to mitigate the impact of the negative, to help to mitigate those traumatic experiences or the impact of the trauma. And so what are the protective and promotive factors that might currently exist already in the community? So I'd like you to jump down some ideas around that. And then finally, where and how can we on the community level support healing and recovery? How can we make that happen? Oh, so okay. So does everyone understand what we're going to be doing in the groups? So we'll break out for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and kind of do a little share. So please bear with me as I try and do these breakout groups. And I do understand that there are some people in the US who aren't with us tonight. So we're just going to go with what we've got here. And I apologize if there's limited people who are from your specific region, but it might be interesting to kind of do a share of what's going on in different parts of the country. So please just bear with me here. Saskatoon. I hope that I got everybody here.
Hey, Heather, it's JJ. I'm just floating at the moment.
Oh, no problem. Then we've got Airdrie, Cheryl. Okay, I think I've got everybody now. So, all right, so I'm going to break everybody out into groups and then we'll go from there. Hmm. So. Melody, Barbara, Air, Jasmine. And Dale, JJ, and Kendra, Honey. Yeah. All right, we'll see you back in 15 minutes. Welcome back, welcome back. So I am super excited to hear from everyone's different regions. And again, I'm sorry, I know that Nova Scotia and Montreal people are just kind of blowing in the wind with some Ontario folks. So yes, I would love to hear from each group about the different things that we came up with here. So we're talking about, of course, the different things in the community backpack that you might be able to identify. So that was the first question. The trauma and adversities and the stressors that are impacting the communities that you're in, the protective and promotive factors that exist within the communities, and where and how can we, i.e. you, when you go back, on the community level, support healing and recovery. So is there a group who would like to go first? Eastern Canada, Vancouver, or the Prairie? Who wants to go first?
I can go for the West Coast, Vancouver.
All right, Vancouver, Dale, thank you so much for representing. Fabulous.
So we identified on a community level 3 of the most prominent issues here for us are homelessness, drug addiction, and random violent attacks that are happening.
Yeah.
And under the random violent attacks, some of it seems to be racially motivated or gang related.
Okay.
So for protective factors, probably across all of them would be like a sense of connection or connection to friends or safe places to go or people that they trust. When it comes to things like drug addiction and homelessness, the protective factor would then be connection to some sort of community resources.
Like, are there, for addictions, for example, are there like safe usage?
Yeah, there's safe injection sites for sure. They've got, I know for downtown Eastside Vancouver, because I worked there for a little bit, they've got bands of peer naloxone peers that ride around on bikes with naloxone kits and make themselves available to, in the moment help somebody out. It's kind of a catch-22 because those resources come with wait lists and referrals. So there's, that promotive, there's really there's a big gap right in between. Like you need a family doctor or you need a psychiatrist in order to get the referral to a mental health unit. Then you're on a wait list, and then and there's kind of really nothing in between. I know part of the problem for promotive you know, which by definition is to compensate for risk exposure. They've closed down a bunch of shelters. So now they don't have shelters when the weather gets adverse anymore. So now you get the odd church will open up a warming space now for maybe a night or two, but then they quickly shut it down again. So there's no long-term solutions. So it's tricky. But protective factors, you know, we talked a lot about youth, is, you know, they seemingly are kind of putting themselves in larger groups of friends. Like, I think there's almost like safety in numbers, but there's also that creates a sense of fear among different groups. So you'll get, it almost creates that gang mentality when the numbers get too big. So again, there's that, is it protective or is it fear inducing? But we talked about how getting kids involved in groups, organized groups where there's some peer support from adults, or sports, where, you know, they're moving their bodies, which is a way of somatically being able to express themselves and get rid of some of those maybe traumatic experiences or emotions that they're feeling. You know, we're seeing a decrease in the amount of protective factors that are being made available in schools. Like, they're taking away the counselors, they're taking away the school nurses, they're, you know, they're cut back on all the resources, and the expressive arts are all getting slashed, and they're, you know, they're dropping the drama the course now, and there's no phys ed anymore in some of the elementary schools, and they're taking away any sort of expressive curriculum. So, but they're not putting anything in its place to sort of buffer those kids. So again, you know, this exercise really sort of points out where the gaps are, you know, you know, where there's no protective, the protective factors are really being left up to people to try to come up with their own.
Kind of like random sort of ad hoc sort of situation.
Yeah. The community is really not able to sort of provide much there. And then as far as healing and recovery and where and how, it's really about breaking down barriers and making the limited resources that we do have more accessible to people. And JJ mentioned about, you know, putting more money into outreach services where the services are going to people instead of waiting for people to come to them, and then making those resources more central so that people can find the resources easier, instead of just handing a parent a long list of phone numbers and they have to try to navigate that system on their own. And then again, a lot of these resources are referral based. So they're very limited as well as to who they're going to allow in to begin with. So, you know, it's really about cracking open the coffers of the government and just getting a lot of money poured into creating more resources that are accessible. It's a mess.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I don't know if Elena or JJ, you guys wanted to add anything to that?
You did a wonderful job, so I'm good.
All right, let's move over to the prairies. We'll travel across the country from west to east. How does that sound? Thank you so much, Dale, for sharing.
Oh, that was us. Myself and Connie, we talked about some of the stress going on here in Alberta. One thing that we acknowledged was there's a huge, I guess, financial stress, probably not just Alberta, but across Canada. Prices going up on everything, gas, food. It's getting hard for people to live nowadays. So that's creating a huge strain on a lot of families and individuals, especially coming after the pandemic, when there's so much fear already, and then people are having to face just fear about how they're going to feed their families or keep a roof over their head and that kind of thing. So there's that. And then we also just talked about across Alberta and probably in other provinces too, just some of the shortages and systemic issues within the healthcare system. If you need an ambulance here in Alberta, it's, you know, you're probably going to have to wait. We don't know like how long people have to wait for surgeries, people that need it, or, you know, the hospitals are full and, you know, there's just all kinds of pressure there. So those were some of the stresses that we identified. Protective factors we talked about were just having a strong support system, not just any kind of people in your life, but people who are open-minded and actually supportive and who non-judgmental and just having the right group of people, maintaining connections, and I guess trying to stay away from isolation, accessing mental health resources, increasing positive coping strategies, which I guess involves a lot of the stuff that we've been learning throughout this course, asking for help if needed, and setting boundaries with certain people or with like with media, social media, because a lot of the stuff that we see is quite negative and is easy to get drawn into. And the last part, promotive, I guess we just had like, you know, to help other people in dealing with these stresses. Sometimes you don't have a solution. We can't change the system. We can't necessarily change the problem. But sometimes just holding space for someone and being someone to listen can be really meaningful, and helping people to find resources that might be able to help. Helping people to increase their internal resources, so that they have more strength and I guess resiliency to cope with the stress. Advocacy for others, and also helping people to advocate for themselves, to have a voice, to connect with other people who have maybe similar interests or similar issues or whatever, and just having a safe place to talk, and just extending hope. So
yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed quite a few things that are being experienced in many places across the country. I think in terms of the, you know, cost of living, of course, skyrocketing as a result of the inflation and interest rates and all of those things, and the scandalous profits of the grocery stores. So yeah, absolutely. So we've got Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. Let's hear from you, please. I think you were the largest group. Thank you so much for sharing, Cheryl.
So we kind of did it by, because we were 3 regions in a sense, right? So, so for the Greater Toronto area, what we wrote down was homelessness. Since COVID, it got a lot worse. Can you hear me?
Sorry, you're kind of fading in and out.
Yeah, it's the computer, sorry. So for Greater Toronto area, we have homelessness.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, escalated since COVID. And so now there's like a stress, like added stress with the weather, because there isn't enough, you know, shelter and warm spaces. But there's also drug paraphernalia that's being left around, and so parents are worried for their children because, you know, obviously if the kids find like the needles and stuff, that's dangerous. So that was something we said. And then there's the in the like South Asian community, there's also a rise in alcohol abuse. There's overall just also the whole social media addiction that's splitting up the families. And that's, it leads to mental health issues and just kind of isolation. And then we wrote down there's also an aspect. It's not just all, we shouldn't just look at like the kind of really intense, like obvious stuff like the homelessness and the drug abuse, and then lose track of the fact that there's many people, who are also suffering from, in silence, like the financial stress, or like just isolation, segregation, and like this kind of have versus have not attitude, like just like distribution, like kind of like this like wealth versus poverty thing that's getting really that's climaxing
or polarized. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, of course my kid's like screaming in the background.
That's okay.
Yeah, and so we kind of like and so in Nova Scotia, it's kind of we said there's similar issues, and then there's also kind of segregation again. And I was like mentioning in Montreal, in the communities that I work with, there's a lot of there is like the whole residential school fallout with suicides, like there's so much violence, there's murders, like spouses killing, there's murders. It's very scary, and there's so much abuse and so much heartache and alcoholism, and there's no real help. There's like there's one friendship center, and then there's like 2 shelters, and they're always full. And like on top of it, like one shelter that I worked at, you can access if you've been using in the last kind of 48 hours. So for most people, they're not going to be admitted into the shelter. So there's just so many different things going on. And so then we said, in terms of protective, I guess we were kind of looking on the negative side. We said there's definitely not enough community spaces, not enough homeless shelters, not enough resources. It's almost impossible to access affordable mental health care. There's a lack of community workers, and I guess we were focused on the bleak.
Well, no, but like this is part of the point of this exercise, is to see where are the big gaps, right? And so this is where, advocacy and other work comes into play, where we can sort of try to promote these changes, because our systems are super broken across the country.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I'm sure this is not new information to people in the United States or in certainly in Europe. These are, I think, very global issues, especially post-pandemic. And is there someone who's from Romania? Did I see that somewhere?
She's not here today.
Yeah, but I mean, she's on the doorstep of the Ukrainian war and the refugee crisis and all of those things. Like, it's just next level, right? All these things that are happening.
Yes.
Absolutely. And so, part of this exercise was to kind of help us identify, okay, what is in place, what needs to be improved, what is missing, and then we can kind of move on to those sort of questions that we had of how can we fill some of the gaps a little bit, right? So Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so we just said like, you know, what we could do individually is just, you know, help the person in front of you, like, even though if that might sound simple, but like not burn, you know, not to like to focus and to give to whoever is in front of you, so, and start healing yourself so that you can actually really help others.
Mm-hmm.
But then of course, you know, we can volunteer our services, we can offer trauma-informed care, and so, you know, sow seeds in the community, like wherever we walk. And I personally, you know, for example, I offer sliding scale, and you know, and I always put it out there, like if someone really can't pay and they need my service, I would never turn anyone away.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you know, I find that's like something that we could all do. Like that's an important thing that, you know, if we're able to offer that, like that we could do. And then we also talked about that it's difficult to, of course, we would love to be, you know, create communities, but it's not as easy as it looks to create like a community space for people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Lots of great takeaways here. And I absolutely will put all these into a Word document and share in the Facebook group. And I'm sure Amanda will upload it to wherever it needs to go. So yeah, I so value all of this. This is really fantastic dialogue and discussion. And I think you're really a great snapshot of opportunity that exists for improvements, and taking all of our knowledge and skills and seeing what we can do about that. So I want to thank you all so much for participating in this activity. There's still so much to talk about and never enough time. So let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 10 after 7, and I'll quickly touch on social justice and empowered leadership, and kind of, I think this activity really sets us up for having that discussion. So now that we look at, oh, these are the gaps, and so now we can look at, okay, what can we do moving forward? So see you all in 5 minutes. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone had a little stretch, got a little drink, got a little snack. We're just gonna, in the interest of time, kind of keep moving forward, and I'll try and do this as succinctly as possible. So I'm sorry, I just have to call out Melody and her amazing profile picture, and this looks like a black lab puppy or dog with a Santa hat on. It melts my heart. I love it so much. I'm a lab person, so just love that picture.
Well, thank you. He's a little Chihuahua miniature pincher.
Oh, he looks much bigger
he's
than he is.
really
Oh, that's so funny.
I'm glad you enjoy him. I do too.
So cute. So thank you for, animal cameos are always my favorite. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen again, I think. Although it's acting strange. Why can't I see anything? I don't understand. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see this. And so we're going to move into our social justice and empowered leadership part of our session today. And so, the idea of social justice talks about the eradication of all social inequities and disparities. So the term social justice, it refers to this political and philosophical theory that focuses on this concept of fairness among all individuals in society and equal access to wealth, opportunities, and social privileges. And I think we just very clearly identified, those gaps that still exist within our society. And so practically just social justice means seeking out ways in which we can address these social issues and injustices, through community support or legal means, cultural means. And so according to the principles of social justice, rights should never be withheld from individuals, nor opportunities withheld because of any kind of identifying factor into a group of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, ability or disability, level of education, socioeconomics, or geographic location, anything that's basically beyond an individual's control. And so the concept of social justice as we know it began in around the time of the Industrial Revolution, so the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And so really the catalyst for all of these movements were these unsafe and abusive work environments, in the factories and in these, business booming and industrialization components. These were big catalysts for this community unrest and sort of banding together, united against towards a common goal. And so in addition to the horrendous working conditions, the widespread marginalization of women became a major source of uprising, and also the marginalization of minority groups within different nation states. And we also saw, of course, how this happened for the Jewish populations in Eastern Europe. And so although we may have made many gains for social justice and equality in some areas over the last century, there continues, I think, as we have just seen, to be much work that needs to be done. And so I'm curious to hear from you, what are examples of current social justice issues that you can identify that still need to be addressed? So feel free to just shout them out because I can't see the chat necessarily, if you're able to.
Women's rights.
Huge one. I mean, we see the rights of women being walked back. We're actually moving backwards, not just in the United States, although horrendously, with that reversing of the Roe versus Wade in the Supreme Court of the United States now I saw actually this morning an interview with a obstetrician, so a gynecologist in Texas, who was explaining that the residents, like the medical residents who were training for gynecology, were not allowed, because they're in Texas, are not allowed to learn how to perform abortions, even though that is a requirement for being certified as an obstetrician. So a really huge example of how not just women's rights, but the revocation of women's rights and how that is impacting medicine, right? As an example. I just heard this today. Great example. What else? Another current social justice issue.
Transgender issues.
Yes, LGBTQ issues, absolutely. And again, that fight for equality, acknowledgement, protection of marriage and civil unions.
Animal rights.
Animal rights, absolutely.
Racism.
Huge. Still, always, unfortunately, yes. Another big one that has been in the news headlines a lot recently is climate change, because I just had the big climate summit there and over in Indonesia. So the issue of climate change and protecting the environment, and what we're going to do about that, because we're at the brink of no return. So lots of work to be done. I'm sure if we sat here long enough, we could come up with a lot more of examples as well. And so in terms of the principles of social justice, we have 5 main principles of social justice. So we have access to resources, which is super important, of course, because it refers to the extent to which different socioeconomic groups receive equal access to services. And so we were talking about the disparities of, access to mental health resources. If you can't afford to pay for private services, the wait lists are huge. And so access to medical care, access to surgeries, access to community resources, and, homeless shelters, and, out of the cold spaces. These are all things that we're talking about. And so many developed societies, although on paper, we are very highly developed, and we offer a multitude of resources and services for our citizens. And we have, social insurance and employment insurance, and these other sort of social support networks in place. However, it's not adequate, right? It's falling short. And so we've got, healthcare, food, and shelter. All of these things are not guaranteed right now. We have education, recreation opportunities, but unequal access to these services exists even in the most developed countries. So, for example, these individuals from more wealthy, well-to-do, higher status households among the upper class or upper middle classes, they're better able to afford to attend good schools, access extracurricular activities, go to post-secondary education, and which again allows them a greater opportunity to get a well-paying job, etc. And then on the other hand, we've got the lower classes and lower socioeconomic status populations who are able to have fewer opportunities, right? And so in turn, that limits their access to education, which limits their ability to break out of that cycle of poverty. And so we have this continuing cycle of marginalization. So access to resources. Equity, number 2, which refers to how individuals are given tools which are specific to their needs and their socioeconomic status, and so that they can all move towards similar outcomes. And so this contrasts with equality, where everyone is offered the same tools. Equity looks at who already has more than someone else. And so if someone else needs more, equitable distribution would say that they get more. than someone who might already be better off. And so often things that are equal are not equitable due to the more advanced needs of some individuals and groups. And so social justice integrated with addressing these equity issues might include advancing policy in government that provides support to overcome those systemic barriers. Participation refers to how everyone in society is given a voice and an opportunity to verbalize their opinions and have their concerns heard and have a role in decision-making that affects their livelihood directly and their standards of living. Social injustice occurs when a small group of individuals, like old white men, for example, makes decisions for the larger group, while some people are unable to voice their opinions at all, which is often the case in countries in totalitarian governments. And so we see, of course, these things happening in countries like China, who are locking down on the protests, and in Russia, of course, who are refusing to acknowledge that they have invaded another country and refuse to call it a war. So, and, are imprisoning people who are speaking out against those things. So then we have, of course, diversity, which speaks for itself. Understanding and appreciating diversity and appreciating the value of cultural differences is really important, because policymakers, so our government officials, they're often better able to create policies that take into consideration those differences that exist among our different groups within society. And so it's important for us to recognize that some groups face more barriers in society, albeit maybe an inconvenient thing to recognize. It is necessary, but by those in power. And by considering those inequities, policymakers and civil servants need to be, and hopefully will become, stronger in a position to expand opportunities for marginalized or disadvantaged groups. And so discrimination in employment on the basis of factors such as race and gender and ethnicity and sex and age and other characteristics, these are constant issues in society. In fact, women in Canada, compared to men, make less now than they did in the 80s. I think we were like 83 cents to the dollar in the 80s, and now we're back down to 78 cents to the dollar for doing the same job. So that's kind of alarming and really unfortunate. So just as an example, I just remembered that statistic off the top of my head. And then finally, human rights. And so human rights, of course, one of the most important principles for social justice, and this forms the foundational part of the concept. And of course, we have all kinds of human rights organizations in place globally. And so human rights and social justice are very interrelated, and it is impossible for one to exist without the other. And human rights are fundamental, of course, to societies that respect the civil, economic, political, cultural, and legal rights of individuals and governments, organizations, and these things need to be held, and we need to be held responsible if they fail to ensure the upholding of these rights. And so many societies fail to recognize and practice human rights decision-making. And so human rights access is recognized, of course, internationally through institutions like the International Criminal Court, the United Nations Human Rights Council, etc. And so if we look at social justice issues, and we mentioned a few already present, past examples of social justice that we have seen in history, of course, the civil rights movement in the United States continues to be a challenge today, but certainly that movement was crucial to the progress that has been made. The labor movement, as we talked about, women's suffrage. So in 1917, for example, in Canada, we had Nellie McClung out in Winnipeg, and a bunch of women who famously, advocated and protested for the rights for women to vote. Coincidentally, the government was sympathetic to the plight because it also served them at that time. They thought if we give women the right to vote, they will vote for conscription because we need more people to go fight in World War I. And so because their loved ones are off fighting, they'll want other people to go relieve them. And so if we let them vote, they will vote for conscription. And so women were given the right to vote. Gender equality, of course, is something that we continue to work on, even though it was something that exists, we started on in the past. And then we talked about all of these issues as well already. So empowered leadership is something that is going to be the basis of all of our conversation and discussions moving forward in this module. And so empowerment, of course, the process of becoming stronger, more confident, especially in controlling our own life and claiming our own rights. And leadership is identified as a process of social influence, which maximizes the efforts of others towards the achievement of a common goal. And so today, the effective leaders that we see are using this power sharing, trust, team building, empowerment movement as tools to guide and drive their respective communities. And so through the leadership style of empowerment, casting this vision provides a shared set of values with a common goal, right? With a focus. And so successful organizations or groups which practice empowerment are really good at delegating and it's expecting people to initiate, create, and to kind of take ownership over what it is that they're doing. And so how can we achieve empowerment? Education is a big piece, leading by example, structuring, mentoring, helping people to actualize things that they want to do. And it requires leaders, genuine empowerment requires leaders to be involved. It requires mentoring, coaching, guiding, to be of service, like a service-based mentality for your team is really important. And this requires frequent and highly involved interactions, not like in a micromanaging, like authoritarian way, but just in a very like involved and collaborative and present way. And so the characteristics of empowered leadership include reminding others of the vision of what it is that we're all doing, communicating effectively, delegating, and not being afraid of letting someone go and run with whatever it is that they've been given to do. Delegating builds trust and it leads to empowerment. And this helps to motivate and it makes people want to continue doing what they're doing. Valuing the gifts and intelligence and tools and skills that each member of the group brings to the table is a huge piece of empowered leadership. And of course, recognizing the wins, no matter how small, again, helps to feel helps people to feel empowered and helps to kind of help to make them feel like they're taking responsibility and that this is something that they want to be proud of. And so valuing each team member is very important, and acknowledging what it is, what positive things they're bringing to the mission or to the goal, to the work. And so whether that's through public or private acknowledgement doesn't matter, but empowered leaders understand that recognition and rewarding people leads to more confidence and allows people to kind of take that sense of agency on. And so why does this matter? Why is this important? Empowered leadership is exactly what we need right now. And so we're looking at building community resilience by encouraging agency in others. And so agency is, of course, that feeling that we are in control of what's going on. And so how do you think that yoga might build community, as an example? Again, I would just invite you all to unmute and share some ideas quickly here.
Through shared experience.
Through shared experience, absolutely. What else?
Connection.
Connection. Mm-hmm.
Moving in unison, in union.
Oh, I love that. Yes, moving in unison. Mhm.
Safe space.
Safe space. Absolutely.
If you had a yoga class set up with an intention in mind, like, you know, if it's trauma informed, then you're healing on a community level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What else? It's this concept, you know, of shared experience, right? Does somebody want to say something?
Also breathing as one.
Oh, I love that. How powerful. Yes. Breathing as one. Yeah. And you can feel that energy collectively in the room, can't you? It's really extremely empowering. I love that. Great example. And so empowered leadership through yoga makes space for us as individuals, and it makes space for us to explore our bodies and ourselves and others. It makes space to create and share ideas, works to implement them whenever we can. And so and you know, you find the great empowered leaders in yoga practice, for example, they nurture the strengths and the talents, you know, and they encourage you to stretch and push just beyond those limits, right? And to explore the edges of the limits as well. And so it encourages growth. Yeah, it builds this sense of accomplishment and collectiveness and shared experience. So I love that. Oh, something here. Yes, collective intention. I love that. Thank you so much, Ananda. So this whole concept of creating agency, you know, and you know, what does agency mean? And so one person has a high sense of agency. And actually, I looked up some statistics on this today, and I'll just really quickly go through this. Agency, people who identify as having high sense of agency is actually only 1% of the population. Most people identify as experiencing low agency, and a small number identifies having medium agency. But the high agency individuals are less than 1% of the world's population, and they actually hold the disproportionate amount of the world's power. And so this is why agency is everything, because we can harness agency and develop it and create higher agency to use that opportunity for good, right? You know, the Nelson Mandelas of the world, for example, high sense of agency with really great influence for the positive. And so we're looking at, you know, how can we, my goodness, excuse me, my dog is just scratching at the door here. How can we create agency within our communities? You know, we've talked about all of these disparities and gaps and pieces that are missing that are desperately needed. And so, you know, we hear the same thing over and over from people who come in, you know, for therapy and different things. You know, they feel overwhelmed by life, and we all feel that at certain points, I think. And so the struggle to make choices and decisions makes us feel stuck, and sometimes we just feel like completely overwhelmed and don't know what to do. And so the pace of life has accelerated for us, you know, to this level where we can't fully adapt all the time. And there's this constant buzz of worry and stress. And, you know, we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, or what we're meant to be doing. And, you know, am I providing value? Or am I getting what I want out of life? And, you know, what am I doing here? And am I making good use of my time and all of these things? And so sometimes we kind of feel this anxiety and this paralysis because we're so like analysis paralysis, and we don't know what to do. We don't know what to cut through all of the distractions to really focus on what pulls us and what we feel emotionally connected to, what we feel passionate about. And so with this sense of agency, we can feel more in command and more in control of our lives. And so when we make voluntary actions, we tend not to feel as though they simply happen to us. We chose to do them. And so we feel as though we're in charge the more and more that we kind of make those decisions for ourselves. And so the sense of agency refers to this feeling of being in the driver's seat of your life, essentially. And so self-agency or personal agency, as we say in psychology, it describes this feeling of being in control of our actions and the consequences that they have on our lives, versus feeling as though things are happening to us and we have no control over anything. And so it's this ability to filter out the unwanted noise and the distractions and to find that emotional and physical balance and thinking more clearly and advocating for ourselves and being self-reflective and being self-aware and finding that sense of purpose that allows us to increase our sense of agency. And this is the goal of why we're here. This is why we're doing what we're doing. And so this is the discussion that we're going to continue having. How can we build opportunities for agency within our communities? And this is a little bit of a homework discussion question I want you to chew on, because what's going to happen is we're going to really explore that in the next few sessions. And so today's discussion was really twofold, to identify those gaps that we have in our society, like we talked about, and to really get us to start thinking, how can we, us individuals, how can we go back to our communities, and how can we start to develop that sense of agency within our communities, and how can we really make a difference and start to help humanity and be that, be the change that we want to see. And so where do we start? And so I invite you to really reflect on this. And it was going to be a bit of a discussion, but I don't want to take your time, but this is really where we're going with the rest of our time together. So you'll learn more about this on Saturday. You'll talk about it more with Amanda, and your social emotional learning capstone project is going to be your opportunity to apply and to actually go back and be that change in the world, in your community. So I'm super excited to see where this all takes you, and what impact that we can all have on the world collectively together. So I want to thank you so much for your time. I apologize for being a few minutes over. I do want to respect your time, so I will wrap things up right now. Please feel free to let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to stay behind and answer them, but I don't want to keep you any longer. So I will, of course, you'll get the upload of the recording and any other resources from the discussions that we had today. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording now.